Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of season 2's Taking Back the Narrative podcast. Today's topic is Jewish Chutzpah, the Ashkenaz journey from Russia to Argentina. And if we have time, we'll even include China as well. So first, I think it's important to really introduce who and what Ashkenaz Jews are. There's a lot of disconnect, not only in the non-Jewish world, but even amongst Jews ourselves for some reason. And I was part of that category up until just a few years ago. And so many erroneously think that Ashkenaz Jews are Jews who are quote unquote from Europe, Jews who are white, white-skinned, racially white. There's a whole mishmash of confusion there. In actuality, as we know, all Jews, whether Mizrahi, Sephardic, Ashkenaz, Persian, all are originally from Israel. And specifically, just a few tribes from Judea, hence Judea Jews. That's where the name comes from. So all modern day Jews who are counted amongst the 15 and a half million Jews genetically are all tied to just a few of those tribes from that region. And so how did Jews get to Europe? What is the Ashkenaz region? And how did Jews who spent their diaspora or parts of their diaspora in Europe even get that name? And so Jews arrived to Europe via a few different routes. The first, in the times of Solomon, they came as traders to the Iberian Peninsula. Another route was as slaves via the Romans. There were slave markets in Gaza, and so Jews were corralled into Gaza and then sent off to Italy around that time of Roman slavery after the destruction of the Second Temple. And then another route, which they're not considered Ashkenaz, we're going to have different episodes about that. The Bukharian Jews are actually Sephardic Jews who spent their diaspora, a good chunk of it, in Iran, and then ended up on the Silk Route and settled into the Soviet republics, which today are independent states, Uzbekistan, and there were Azari Jews who lived, or some still live, in Azerbaijan. And so how did Jews actually get to the Ashkenaz region between France and Germany? So actually the first Jews who got into that region, I just learned about this a couple of years ago, was a group of 20,000 Italian Jews who ended up in the Ashkenaz region, and then were joined by Jews moving from west to east. As Jews were being expelled, they kept being either invited for obviously very economical purposes, as Jews were the only ones who could lend money at the time. So a lot of kings would use Jews, for specific purposes. So they would invite the Jews, and that kept happening along the routes from west to east, along the European continent. And so it's also a misnomer that the Czar Empire ended up all converting and becoming Jews, right? That's one of the most anti-Semitic tropes out there, is that the Jews who spent their diaspora in Europe are not real Jews, we're all Khazars. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. The king was very philo-Semitic, the king of the Khazarian Empire. Only he converted. Interestingly enough, most of his empire converted from Christianity to Islam. They just happened to be very pro-Jewish, engaged in trade with Jews, respected Jews, as Jews had to fight off lots of attackers along the Silk Route. So they saw Jews as warriors, which we are, not to focus on some of the weak points of our history, and that we even didn't have, even at the worst of times, there was utmost, stories of strength emanating from the most evil of atrocities, fighting back against that. So I thought it was very apropos to have you on, Barbara, to talk about that journey, right? The diverse Ashkenaz experience, particularly you and I were talking about our own families, and we had talked about some of our relatives ending up in Argentina, some of our relatives ending up in China. And so we'll really dig into that in this episode. So formally, I would like to welcome Barbara Krystal, who is Taking Back the Narrative's newest Director of Educational Outreach. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you, Lorraine. I'm so happy to talk with you.
Thank you so much. So I think we should just start off very generally. How did members of our families end up in Argentina? And I will ask you first.
Well, I'm very certain that you and I are most likely related, as all Jews are. And I love that you use the word chutzpah and warrior, because that definitely resonates with our own journeys and the journeys of my family. So Argentina had 3 waves of immigration. So it actually began with the Jews escaping the Inquisition in Spain. And of course, Argentina was a Spanish colony. And again, why I love the words chutzpah and warriors is that Jews were also explorers. And the rumor being that Christopher Columbus was also himself a Jew. So there was already a presence in Argentina of Jews. So like you said, there's a diaspora, there's connections, there's trade, there's discussion. So people were familiar with Argentina, albeit it was at the bottom of the world, according to most people's thinking. Second wave was from Russia, from Pale of Settlement, and really because of the pogroms. Imagine Fiddler on the Roof. And the idea of escaping, and Argentina had an open immigration policy, meaning they were welcoming Jews and they were welcoming people to cultivate and civilize the land as they saw it. We'll talk more about that later in terms of moving away from the gaucho nomadic identity. And my own family was part of the 3rd wave of escapees from the Holocaust, both from Russia and Poland. And although Argentina had a quota, they were still able to finesse their way into the region and settle as shopkeepers and marketers, again, contributing to the economic viability of Argentina, which was really its goal. And that's why it allowed so many Jews to enter, thinking that it was going to be prosperous for them and to establish their place as a so-called other Europe. In fact, Buenos Aires is often referred to as the Paris of South America.
Wow. So you provided myself and our listening audience and our viewing audience with a lot of information. Actually, I just always think it's interesting with all these podcasts that I've been doing. I always learn something, some bit of information from guests. And you, Barbara, are no different. I completely either forgot or did not even read that Jews were there from the time of the Inquisition. So my question to you, I know that, and this is completely off cuff here, I was reading about Jews who ended up in Indonesia after the Inquisition. But then when the Portuguese ended up there, just like the Portuguese Empire ended up in Goa in India, and Jews had escaped to parts of India after the Inquisition or during the Inquisition as well, they were also persecuted in those far-flung places, right? That they were thinking that they got as far away as they could, they were expelled, they were untouchable, and lo and behold, here they were facing severe anti-Semitism, persecution, killings again. Do you know, and if not, that's fine, but do you know if the long arm of the Inquisition reached the Jews in Argentina?
From my understanding, from what I read, and from my studies in the past, that it did indeed reach Argentina. And because of, again, lack of a better word, pogroms and forced conversions in Spain, many Jews were heading towards Argentina as a safer haven as opposed to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So it really does go back to your concept of this warrior spirit, this idea of flinging yourself to the world, essentially, getting on a boat to nowhere
Mm-hmm.
with whatever you have in your pocket and meeting other Jews from other places. So why Argentina is such a rich country for Jews is that there really was a conglomeration of Jews from Sephardic background and Mizrahi background and Ashkenazi background, and they were bonded together via Zionism, via their collective sensibility and relationship to Israel. So I think that also extends to what you're saying in terms of the Jews in Spain and the Inquisition, and then being forced out, and the Jews deciding to go to Argentina and having that meeting ground and thriving and uplifting their Zionist identity, especially because of the Inquisition.
Interesting. And so speaking of warriors, and we were talking, I think you mentioned boats as well. So I had recently read that there were a lot of Jews who were pirates.
Yes.
And the reason they were, and I love it, it's funny, like some people might shy away, like, oh no, like they were committing crime. I love, not that I endorse crime or condone it, but just knowing why a lot of Jews became pirates, it's because they wanted to really fight back against their oppressors, against the Inquisition, right? Like the Spain controlled the waters, Portugal controlled the waters, and so they said it's just our right to take what's being pillaged, some of that's ours, and let's sock it to them, and they did so very, very successfully. So it's interesting. So your family came to Argentina much later than some of. Oh, and when we say family, are you talking about extended family for your part?
I'm talking about my grandparents, both maternal and paternal, and they too also got on a boat. And I found their records from Poland and Russia to Argentina. And interestingly enough, their nationality said Jew. Mm-hmm. In translation. So they didn't have a nationality other than Jew. So to be Jewish is to have, of course, a religion, it's a race, and it's a nationality. It's all encompassing. And that's why I think boats are also really tremendous in this history, because boats, and also as a marine biologist myself, I'm very much aware of the freedom of the seas. Right? It's a term that was coined in the 1600s. And not only was it about freedom, but it was an exchange of ideas and an exchange of cultural values and an exchange of beliefs. So the ocean was like a laboratory. And so you had this mixing and this merging and this heterogeneous collection of people learning from one another and adopting their particular traits or their particular beliefs, and then bringing them back home. And so I love that, because it really is this idea of exchange in terms of, again, what we're saying with Judaism, bringing in values, bringing in ideas, and having other cultures incorporate them into their own.
I think it's fascinating. Your grandparents actually ended up in Argentina. For me, I have a very interesting anecdote I'd like to share how I found out I even had a family in Argentina. So let's rewind back to 16-year-old me. I was at a family wedding, and I had seen a good-looking boy my age, around maybe a little bit older, maybe like 20 feet away. And so I didn't know anyone at this wedding except for my parents. And so I came up to my father and I said, I don't know why I was so comfortable telling my father that I thought a boy was cute at that age, but I did. And so I said, hey, Dad, I don't know anyone here, but it's a family wedding. Do you know who that guy is? Like, I've never seen him before. I think he's really good looking. My dad laughs. He walks over to this young man, puts his arm around him, and I'm still confused. I'm thinking, how does like, he can't know him? I've never seen him in my life before.
Yeah.
I've met all my cousins. I've met my cousins in Canada, in the US, in Israel. Like we've exhausted the family tree, or so I thought. And so he brings this cute guy, or who I thought was cute at the time, very quickly changed my mind after what I found out. And so he brings him over to me and says, meet your, I think it was like third cousin. I forgot his name at this point. I was so embarrassed
Yeah.
because how could I say that a relative of mine is cute? So
Right.
in defense, I did not know he was a relative. And as soon as I found out, no more thinking that the young guy was cute. But anyway, so, and I said to my parents right after the wedding, I said, who are these people? And my dad said, okay, so those are cousins on my side. And that whole family is from Argentina. And when he said from, he means like they've experienced most of their diaspora in
Yeah.
Argentina. And so I remember that story. So again, I was what, 16 years old, and put it back in a very far off, non-important part of my brain as a memory, not to really focus on. And I think most of the audience on this podcast knows by now, I was, not, I didn't identify as a Jew. I thought that being Jewish was a religion, didn't understand Jews are people back then. I was anti-Israel up until 2014. So I never really thought to investigate, okay, fine, so I live in Argentina, and that's good enough for me. And then I would say only a couple of years ago, I was talking with my father and I said, can you tell me a little bit more about that side of the family? How did they end up in Argentina? To me, that's a very interesting place for Jews to be.
Yeah.
I now know a lot of Jews in Argentina, but back, maybe 5, 6 years ago, I did not. So the story is that in 1904, my father's great 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 uncles at that point, must have been great great uncles, were just exhausted and pissed off after all the pogroms of the Czar, right? Like, yeah, like turn of the century, 1904. And so 3 of the 4 brothers set off to Argentina by themselves. And I just thought it was the most fascinating story of our family.
Yeah.
And I said, so what did they end up doing in Argentina? Like they just came there and then what? And he said, oh, and they became cattle ranchers. I'm like, we have cowboys and cattle ranchers in our family that I want to explore further. And so unfortunately, just because that side of the family ended up not staying that close, to my immediate family,
Right.
there's only so much that I could explore. So one of my hopes and my dreams is to travel to Argentina and somehow look up that family, including that cousin of mine whom I had met at that wedding, who now is somewhere, I think, in Georgia, coaching soccer at some university. But like just to explore that. And then I remember a couple of years, maybe this was post lockdown, so probably 2021. I had been at a Jewish film festival here in New York, and there was a film about a semi-controversial topic that around the turn of the century, which would have been my uncles and how they got to Argentina, it was just a slew of young Jewish men who had arrived to Argentina. And where were the women, right? The women were not coming with them, but women were needed in that community to have families. And so I don't know if all of the women came like this, I hope not. But it turns out that a lot of Jewish women from Poland were sort of tricked into coming to Argentina, obviously to be wives, to these men. So they were invited in not the most kosher circumstances, but many of them stayed, and there was no abuse of any sorts, but just the trickery that was used to then build up those communities around that time. So I thought that was interesting how there've been like films about Jews in Argentina, but from multi.
Right.
So I would like to then pivot to, okay, so we're talking about how, my extended family, some parts of my extended family ended up in Argentina.
Mhm.
Your grandparents had ended up in Argentina, but they had left from Russia. So I would like to hear more. Just, I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
The family story during, well, after Russia. I know that your grandparents ended up in Argentina. Where did the rest of your family end up? So I'd like to hear more about your family journey.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that you saw that film, because there is, what we often call a narrative truth and a historical truth. And the history, of course, is what's recorded, and the narrative are people's individual stories. And so, unfortunately, the majority of my family were murdered in the Holocaust. So only my maternal grandparents and paternal grandparents survived. And they did form a rich Jewish community in Argentina. So I was always around that. And they also formed a rich Jewish relationship with people who had come there prior, who had worked the land. And working the land and owning the land was part of the Zionist tradition, which is why the Jews of Argentina really had Zionist pride and felt that Argentina was emblematic of living in Israel, in many ways. But my own family were shopkeepers, and they tended to their, hacienda, so to speak. And so there was a vibrant Jewish community in Buenos Aires, in the city. And they brought a lot of, again, their European sensibilities to that, with art, with theater, with literature. And so while they felt themselves very much Argentinian and nationalistic and prideful, they still maintained a really strong and rich Jewish-centered community and Jewish-centered beliefs and traditions and practices. So that's what I grew up with. And they were not comfortable talking about the past and the Holocaust, as most people were. I heard snippets of other people's conversations as we would sit around drinking the mate, which is basically this gourd full of tea that you put water in and you stick a straw in and you pass it around. So I have vivid memories of Argentina, going to the beach, Mar del Plata, even the public transportation, because it really was a cosmopolitan city when I lived there, and when my parents lived there. But because of the later dirty war, where there was a military coup, and Argentina was also not a stranger to its own political strife and turmoil, with continuous change of leadership and political regimes, dictatorships, etc. We relocated to the United States because of that. And that's where my life then took off.
How old were you when you immigrated to the US?
I was 6.
Okay, so you did spend your first formative years down in Argentina.
I went to Jewish school, and again, one of the reasons why we were also looking to move is there was actually an incident where they thought I was kidnapped. Because I was younger, I had really white hair, blue eyes, pale skin, and I was going to the Jewish school, and I was tired, so I decided to take a nap. And there happened to be like a crib or a cradle or something of that nature with a doll in it for the younger kids to play with, because it was a smaller school. And I climbed into bed with that doll, and everyone kept passing by me and thinking I was just another doll in the crib. And it just created quite the uproar. And by luck or crux, we were able to get green cards to the United States. And we then ventured on our own airplane, not boat, to America and landed in San Francisco.
Very, very interesting. And so do you know anything about your family, your family's history in Russia? Do you know like how many years or centuries they were there, where they came from? I use that in loose quotes, before Russia.
No one spoke about it, and I was not able to trace any genealogy. So as far as I know, and the things that I gleaned from eavesdropping, they were always in Warsaw and in Russia, and they were always just part of the Jewish community there, peddling, trading, like you said, lending money, doing whatever they could just to survive, because they couldn't own land and they couldn't be professionals. Whereas Argentina had that open door policy and really welcomed that professionalism and that spirit. And they were looking to civilize Argentina, and they thought the best way to do that was to import Jews. And there's actually a motto from the 1800s into the early 1900s where they said that they harvest wheat and they sow physicians. So that was the kind of motto mantra of this concept of moving and upward mobility in many ways, because agriculture was difficult, farming was difficult, and it was new to people, and it was new to the people that my grandparents were friends with, right? Because there was still a welcoming committee that invited them to understand the extent of Jewish existence in Argentina.
Mm-hmm. So just like you, on my maternal side of the family, they don't know how long they were in Russia for. We're surmising, I don't think there were Jews in Russia. And if anyone knows, please email me or leave a comment. But for what I know, I don't think there were Jews in Russia prior to the beginning of the 1600s. So I'm not sure on my maternal side how long, but we know that my grandmother, fourth great grandmother, like she had been born in Russia. On my paternal side, that side of the family kept their genealogy records a lot more close to the heart. So I know that my last name Lipsky stems from Leipzig, from Germany. And so everyone living in Leipzig at the time, Jew or non-Jew, their last name was Leipzig. And then as both Jews and non-Jews began to move east, that name was Slavicized. And so most of the Jews ended up with a Y on their last name for Lipsky, and most of the Catholics ended up with an I. Although my family has a family crest, which is very unusual for Jews. And there are some even Polish Catholic priests with the last name Lipsky with a Y. So I thought that was very And then in terms of the Holocaust, on my mother's side, her mother's family were very fortunate. My maternal grandmother saved my entire family on that side, because, in World War I, the Germans left Jews alone. And so unfortunately, a lot of Jews at the cusp of World War II were very complacent, and they were thinking, well, we have a history of Germany, but nothing will happen. And so my great grandfather was one of those Jews, and he had said, nothing to worry about. Again, the Jews were left alone in World War I, no need to panic. My grandmother, who was a young adult at the time, I believe she was 20, 21, made her entire family escape to the Ural Mountains. And it was just such a luck of the draw, because, like in Russia, they were recruiting women into the army as well. And they had these military schools. And I just learned that my grandmother was one of the top snipers in that school. So I think she was like right about to get her draft notice, or something happened. And so she made secret arrangements to get her whole family. Like she knew what was going to happen. With Germany, she was paying a lot more attention. And 5 days after she evacuated her whole family into the Ural Mountains, which was like a 18-hour train ride out into the east, wilderness of Russia at the time, 5 days later, the Nazis came and conquered Belarus, and anyone who stayed behind was obviously murdered. And then my mother's father's side, unfortunately, most of them were murdered, not by Nazis, but by locals in Lvov, in then Poland and what is now Ukraine. And my dad's side, those who heard the call, like amongst the community to escape before the Nazis came, they did. They were also in Belarus. And then I never knew where they escaped to, because I only heard on one side, that we're all mountains. And my dad never mentioned where his family, those who were, again, lucky enough to escape, just found out a couple of weeks ago. It was to Uzbekistan in Tashkent.
Yeah.
There are a lot of Jews. Apparently there's something like 40,000 Jews who were, again, lucky enough from the Russian region ended up in Tashkent. And there was no issues there, and they were protected, and they just stayed for the duration of the war. And then after the war, they returned back. But one of my goals, I don't know if this is going to be realizable or not, I really want to find out back in time how my family even ended up in Europe. Was it as slaves? Was it as merchants? Was it through another possible window? So hopefully in the next year or two, I would love to work with a Jewish genealogist to.
Yes.
I know also there was a bottleneck of Jews in Lucca, Italy, for about 200 years before they moved on to more eastern parts and became part of that first Ashkenaz community. So it's fascinating. I feel like Italy is going to hold the key to a lot of our questions.
Yeah.
So
I do want to recommend one book to you. It's called Tevia's Daughter by Sarah Zaydeh. And she actually does talk about the ways in which the Jewish communities expanded from Russia outwards and where they ended up.
Right. No, that I love to hear all that. And then if anyone has a book, how do we find out how, did we get in through Italy? Did we get in through Spain? I know I did a DNA test, and I found out I'm 100% genetically Jewish, 92% Ashkenaz, 6% Iberian, and 2% Italian. So perhaps someone down the line obviously was on the Iberian Peninsula. Some people must have been coming in as slaves and then all intermixed. So I find it quite fascinating. So I want to return back to what you said about Jews being able to own land in Argentina, because again, I was reading this very quickly. I was under the impression that Jews were not allowed to hold property. So I always wanted to know how and why did Jews end up becoming cowboys of all professions? And you said the proper word, it's called gauchos.
Yes.
Okay, so could you shed a little bit more light on that?
Definitely. And things are really complex. So there was the sense of ownership and not ownership. So the railroad entrepreneur, Baron Hirsch, purchased a great deal of land to bring Jews over to teach them the agricultural trade and to also promote this Zionist idea. And so when all the Jews did come, they found out that they owned the land, but then they had to pay it back. So not pay back the land, but pay back Baron Hirsch. So there was a lot of complications in terms of mortgages and deeds and confusion, as things all happen to be. But for the most part, they came because of that connection to the land and that revitalization of the Zionist spirit, which is to cultivate the land and to connect with the land and have that kind of agricultural spirit and understanding of what it means to be connected. The gauchos were actually nomadic, and they were kind of a folk hero of Argentina. They helped to fight the War of Independence to gain freedom from Spain, but then they were thought of as subversive, and they were thought of basically flinging Argentina back into the dark ages with this idea of not having any roots, any nationalism, or any sort of identity, which again is why Argentina allowed the Jews to come in here and sort of revitalize the idea of being a nation. The Jewish gaucho is a kind of play on word. It was coined by Alberto Gershinoff. So it really does not connect to this idea of a nomad, other than sort of the irony and satire that the Jew in Argentina was no longer a nomad. So it's borrowing this word, this idea of gaucho, to sort of play upon this concept of the wandering Jew, but now having an actual place and an actual location and an actual identity as Jewish and Argentinian. So Alberto Gershinoff is a writer, and he wrote a lot of these folk tales that discuss everyday life for the Jewish person in these colonies, in these agricultural communities. And they're just a wealth of like little tidbits and just really exciting, interesting stories. For example, one called Shabbat, where a man is davening and a burglar comes in to steal a menorah. And the man davening or praying says to the burglar, "It's Shabbat," and the burglar still steals the menorah and leaves. And then he tells his wife, and the wife said, "What did you do?" And he said, "Well, obviously I told him it was Shabbat." So it's this intermingling of this idea of Jewishness and traditions and beliefs and values with this national Argentinian connectivity. So the gaucho idea was a way to illustrate that we belong, we're part of this liberation, this freedom, this identity, but we're also no longer wandering. And that was kind of like satirical, witty way of showcasing the Jew in Argentina.
Wow, so that sounds fascinating. I know I want to add that to my reading list. If you can
Yes.
send me the link, we will share it.
Yes,
as
absolutely.
part of the description. I just think that so many people can benefit from that, really interesting insight into a very specific culture, which just does not exist right now in the world. And so unfortunately, it would not be a podcast on anything Jewish related if we're not talking about anti-Semitism. And so I was always thinking that how did Jews react, right? Because like you said, like your grandparents came to Argentina to escape to escape the Holocaust or post-Holocaust. And yet there was an influx of Nazis coming into Argentina. So was there a spike of anti-Semitism in Argentina right after World War II, or were the two communities very separated that Jews never really saw much? If you could expand on that a little bit more.
Absolutely. And as we know from history and from present day, anti-Semitism is complex. Mm-hmm. It's an unruly monster, for a lack of a better way to actually explain it, because a monster shifts, it shapes itself and also is shaped by the world. So it's a shapeshifter. And while Argentina was welcoming to Jews, the first recorded pogrom was actually in 1919 called Tragic Week, because as we know, there's a Jewish philosophy of tikkun olam, which is basically to take care of the world, to contribute, democratic values, all the things that we learn from the Ten Commandments and the Torah, essentially to thrive and to better yourself and better your community, which essentially is our goal. And it's what also makes us Jewish via our sensibilities. We connect, we adapt, and we work together. So with that in mind, Jews, of course, were interested in supporting the workers and worker reform and changing social conditions for the working class, everybody, not just Jews. And a group of young patriots thought that the Jews were bringing in these Bolshevik ideas, called them Russos, and then there was a pogrom. So that was in 1919. And because we know the world is complicated, We know that even though there's officials, there's governments controlling a nation, there's still unruly characters, surreptitious characters, characters who are willing to be bribed. And so many Nazi fugitives bribed officials in Argentina to also be allowed entry. And they hid that from the government. And they hid that from a lot of people. And in 1960, when Mossad kidnapped Adolf Eichmann from Argentina and brought him to trial in Israel for crimes against humanity, Argentina felt ridiculed, and unfortunately, relations between the two nations drifted apart. And while they were repaired, we did see other anti-Semitic incidents, as we will talk about, I'm sure, with the 1992 bombing of the Israeli embassy and the 1994 bombing of the AMIA building.
So we can actually get into that right now, because there has been controversies, like still to this day, being uncovered as related to the 1994 AMIA attack. So could you talk a little bit more? So from what I understand, it was basically the embassy of Israel in 1994. Is that correct? That was
in 1992 it was the embassy of Israel, and in 1994 it's basically like a cultural center.
Okay.
MIA. It was a cultural center for Jewish life, Jewish activity, Jewish connectivity.
And was Iran behind both of them, or just in 1994?
From what I know, there's still controversy as to who is taking credit, and obviously the investigation of Argentina. It wasn't until 2006 that Argentina stated that they speculated it was Iran executed by Hezbollah.
Right. And has a foothold in Argentina.
Yes.
And do you know how long that foothold has been? Is that recent? Is that decades old?
I don't have any evidence one way or the other, but I imagine and surmise it was decades old, because it does take time to not only accumulate the materials and build it and hide it, but then also plan the execution.
Right. And then there's, I believe there's actually a documentary right now, and forgive me, I forgot his name, but feel free to fill in if you know. But wasn't there a Jewish prosecutor that went missing or died under mysterious circumstances? And because he was trying to unravel the cover up that was happening?
That is correct.
Mm-hmm. I forgot his name, but
I forgot his name too, but it's true. He was revealing the fact that Argentina may have been complicit in this, and may have also been part of this scandal of accepting a bribe, because again, after the Eichmann, debacle, so to speak, where Argentina felt humiliated, there was this sense of now the Jewish people are not Argentinian. And the Jewish people in the nation living in Argentina will be the ones that suffer, will be the ones that essentially pay the price. And even the media in 1994 separated the intended target, which essentially were the Jews in the MIAA building, from the innocent bystanders.
I see.
So in that moment, it was revelatory that the Jews were no longer considered part of the nation, and they were their own sort of pueblo, is what they called it, pueblo judío.
And unfortunately, we see that everywhere, even in New York, right? Like I moved to New York in 2004, felt very comfortable here as a Jew. And even though, I'm not Orthodox, like I don't have, unless I put on my Magen David, I don't have any outward, appearance of being a Jew. But, suddenly, a couple of years ago, it was 2020, there were Hamas rallies here. And anytime there's a Hamas war against Israel, somehow the Jews are blamed here. and not the terrorist supporters who are in the streets marching, right? And that's the thing, right? Like Jews are not, America's unique, right? Because America, everyone's considered American, those who are here legally, but nowhere else. Like I know when my parents were living in Russia, in Belarus, they were not considered to be Russian. They were Soviets.
Yeah.
They had a J on their passport, and so even though it was done for anti-Semitic purposes, but they technically were correct, right? Because my parents and my grandparents were not and are not Slavic, ethnically. They are Jews. We are an ethnicity. And so when anyone asks me, oh, what's your background? I proudly say, I'm a Jew. And then they say, oh, but that's your religion. I said, nope, that's my ethnicity. I said, my faith is Judaism. My ethnicity is Jew. And my nationality is an American. So I think therein lies a lot of the confusion that even I felt that really could help to move the conversation forward in combating even anti-Semitism, right? Like not to see us as just another religion. But so speaking of Israel, and you had mentioned that post Eichmann relations had soured, from Argentina to Israel. So those interceding decades from the 60s to the bombing, the first bombing, which honestly I did not even know about. All I've heard about was 1994. I thought there was one. I had no idea about 1992. So those about 3 decades. How was, if you happen to know, how was the relationship between Argentina and Israel? Were relations patched up? Did Argentina move on, or did they still hold a grudge?
They still held a grudge, as far as I know, and there again was some distancing, for sure. And what you said about America in terms of ethnicity and your nationality and how you identify was also seeping into Argentina, because Jews have this singularity where they're accused of dual loyalty, where no one else is, even though America had this onslaught of this hyphenated identity that grew in the 70s, where people were all of a sudden Italian American or Mexican American or whatever American. And that was fine, but the Jewish American was a problem in and of itself, and some outlier that didn't quite fit in. But in terms of Argentina and Israel, there was some cooling. And again, that seeped into this idea where the Jews were no longer considered Argentinian. So in that regard, there was questioning of loyalties. Mm-hmm. And who are you really? And how do we see you versus how you see yourself?
And so even though there was that cooling between, or not between, I guess it was more one-sided, from Argentina to Israel, you had mentioned the Zionism of the Jews, right? What inspired Jews, to become agriculturists in Argentina, their strong connection, even connecting different Jewish backgrounds, like those who came, from Inquisition times and their legacies, to those who came during my great uncle's times, our family's times. And I've noticed, I don't know if you've noticed this, but I've definitely noticed this lately. Only in America, sadly, do we have self-hating Jews who are not, and I'm not saying all Jews, but there are, unfortunately, a portion of Jews who are anti-Israel, and I was one of them for 20 years. You just don't find that anywhere else in the diaspora, right? Like, I talk to European Jews. Everyone I've talked to who lives in Europe loves Israel as a proud Zionist. I've met Jews from Brazil. I've now met Jews from Argentina, Jews from Panama, Guatemala, Zionists as can be. And so how can one explain that, right? Like, how come only in America? Or am I wrong? Like, or is not everyone who's Jewish, Zionist, from Argentina? And how does that also affect the stream of Aliyah right? Because like here, like we always hear the numbers from Nefesh B'Nefesh, we have 20,000, 50,000 like coming from America, and they're proud. And so, but here in America, we have, I think, 6 million Jews, right? Because there's 7.5 million in Israel, about 6 in America. And so, but in Argentina, obviously there's a significantly smaller number of Jews. But I've also read and I've heard that a lot of Argentinian Jews are making Aliyah, obviously, fueled by Zionism, by economic conditions. So how do you think that is affecting or will affect the future Jewish community in Argentina?
I think what you're saying is relevant, and I also think that there's waves.
Mhm.
When I was in college, we were all Zionists. I think there's an active propaganda sponsored by the PLO that paints Arabs as a victim of Israel occupation, and it paints Israel and Jews as white colonialists. And that began, I think, in the early 2000s, and that colored the universities. And so that wave ran rampant for a while, but I think that that's changing. And I think because Jews feel in the middle, sort of pushed by the right and the left in their ideologies, they are becoming proud, and they are becoming more aware that our history and our legacy is rich, it's varied, and it's not just, Moses and the Holocaust. So I think that the more that Jews learn about our history, our culture, what we've contributed to the world, that proudness will rise again. And I think for the most part, in terms of Argentines moving to Israel, it is economic. I mean, there's been a long depression in Argentina that's still long lasting. But I think Argentina really benefited from the Jewish presence. They have an entire plaza named Freud, and they have the highest per capita psychoanalysts in any country in the world.
Wow.
And they've really gleaned a lot from our culture, our minds, and they're aware of it. And sometimes, again, the complexity of the human, mind and psyche is one that you don't want to be beholden to someone. Mm-hmm. And I feel like beforehand, people felt beholden to Israel, beholden to Jews, and felt sort of an inferior complex because of that. And so they painted the Jews as, a white colonialist, a supremacist, a wanderer who really has no place and therefore is subversive and creating, like we said before, a lawless society, like, in terms of the ocean and the laboratory and experimental and progressiveness, all ideas that people were afraid of because they thought it undermined society, even though they clearly attached to things that they thought were beneficial to them. So I haven't come across many self-hating Jews. I was in the university setting for 10 years. I did witness the usual Nakba demonstrations from the PLO that is perpetrated on May 14th, Israel Independence Day. But they've been slight and small. And while they may have grown across universities, I think from the many organizations that you and I are aware of, that there is a pushback now, and we're not going to allow people to be nefarious and surreptitious in terms of backstabbing Israel or Jews in the United States. And Jews are no longer going to be presenting themselves as a kind of victim or complicit in the narratives that other people create about us.
Absolutely. And so do you think that, we're talking about that a lot of the Argentinian Jews are leaving for economic purposes.
Yes.
Do you think that there's a danger that the community will ever dwindle down to paltry numbers? Because I just had a really fascinating episode with a Cochin Jew in India, and they had arrived in, which is now called Kerala, back in King Solomon times. So right, was it before? Yeah, I think it was even before the destruction of the first temple. And so he said that our community, though, didn't face a lot of anti-Semitism. I'm not going to give away too much of the episode. It's live, but there was one massive anti-Semitic incident centuries ago, and it affected the community greatly, but it had no further incidents since. But the community just dwindled down to 15 members because everyone had made Aliyah.
Sure.
So do you see that happening in the future with the Jews in Argentina, or not as much?
I do feel that Jews in Argentina will be steadily making Aliyah. Again, I think it's mainly for economic reasons, but also when they see their numbers dwindling, they might either feel alone, or I'm imagining if their numbers are dwindling, they're no longer held responsible, per se, for speaking for all Jews and about Jews. So I imagine that the smaller the numbers, the less you are bearing the burden or the weight or the catastrophe, right, of being Jewish and contributing everything that we've contributed to the world. So I think that will actually keep the Jewish people in Argentina safe in that regard. But I think because of the way global politics are happening, and the more that we're becoming aware of the world and how it's changing, that Israel seems to be home.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right? And it is. And even I myself am contemplating making Aliyah, just because of what I know here in the United States, not necessarily, anti-Semitism, although it is growing, like you said, you witnessed those parades in New York. But I see what's happening in our Congress. I see what's happening, in our political arena, in our political sphere. And I don't think it's safe for anyone anymore, to be honest, considering how divisive we've all become, and can't even have a conversation with someone, and everything is walking on eggshells. And to be frank, I'm attending lectures where the title is Whiteness at Work or Decentering Whiteness. And as much as I say I'm not white like you, I put Jewish, I'm now grouped and cataloged into an arena that I don't know anything about and I'm not a part of, regardless of the fact that I speak English. I grew up speaking Hebrew, Polish, Russian, Yiddish, Italian, and I still smatter all those languages together when I talk. Right? And now I know there's a word for it. It's called code switching. And there's actually a grammar to it and a whole area of study. So it's not illegitimate for me to mix in 5 languages and articulate and make sense to someone else. And so, yeah, it's this real unique place for us. Like, where actually do we belong, considering we have our sensibility, our shared Zionism, our shared traditions, beliefs, even if, it's somewhere between, kugel and baklava, there's still a connection.
Absolutely. So maybe you should have that, Jay, when you're attending the conference, and say that, look, I'm exempt from your whiteness.
Yes.
It's so true. I mean, honestly, Jessica, I have fair skin, but in my family, well, first of all, skin color is not race. There are Arabs that are lighter than me. There are Jews that are darker than the darkest Arab. And so in my family alone, we have a range of skin tones, number one. Like, my sister's 7 shades darker than I am. She went after my maternal grandfather's side of the family. They were all very white skinned. But even growing up, I'm first generation American, you're an immigrant, but I was born here, but first generation. honestly, before I even knew about race and all that, I never felt white. You know, I had white friends, white racial, like
Mhm.
WASPs, as we would call them. And I never felt that connection. Like we had different values, different ways of interacting with our parents,
Yeah.
like even calling. Like I remember being in college and my non-Jewish friends did not understand why I would talk to my mom every night or every other night. Like that was seen as odd. Like, did you just talk to your mom like yesterday? And then I would be really surprised that my waspy friend thought it was too much that she talked to her mom a week ago. Like it
Mhm.
just that,
Yes.
right? Or even like, my Italian friends, like we obviously had more in common. So
Yes.
just like, even better, like, like my father's pastimes were not the same as my non-Jewish, dad's pastimes. So it just like you felt like it, not that I felt discrimination, but I just felt different. Like I knew that I was
Yeah.
not like them. I just didn't have the vocabulary or the sense of identity to explain all that.
Yeah, of course. And we have a humor and a richness and vivacity in the way we think. And I think that connects us
Absolutely.
in,
And not to
in
say
rich
like,
ways.
right. And we're not better. Like I always say, like, like I personally, I don't like when Jews say like, oh, we're the chosen ones. Like I don't think that Jews are better than anyone, but we're different, right? And so like, when you go to another country and you meet a Jew from another country, you have more of a connection with that Jew than you
Yeah.
do with someone who came on the Mayflower here and is not Jewish. It's just the reality of it. And so to speaking of Jewish diversity, so I know we touched upon Argentina a lot. We also offline talked about China and how both of our families had some experience with living in China. I'll start off with mine just because mine is fairly brief. Again, very recently found out in the past maybe 6, 7 years or so that my mom's cousin was born in China. And I said, wait, how did that happen? Which seems to duplicate a lot of my reactions to finding
Yes.
out
How did that
how did
happen?
that happen? How did the Jewish cowboys happen in Argentina? How did that happen in China? No. So apparently, so my mom's cousin was born, interestingly enough, the same day that my mom was born. So my mom was being born in Belarus and her cousin was being born in, I don't know what it's called now, but it was called Port of Artur. And it was the site of one of the battles between Russia and China during the Sino-Russo War in the late 1800s. And so during World War II, Russia just had bases in China that it had kept. And so sent my cousin's parents, or her father, excuse me, her father was an engineer and was sending him to test bombs, missiles over in China. So that's how they ended up in China during World War II, how my cousin was born there. And so on her passport, it says born in China and she's Jewish. And then recently I was watching this documentary about the Jews of Harbin, China, which is all the way up on the tippy north.
Yes.
So to repeat that question, how did Jews end up in Harbin? So again, anti-Semitism is the answer. So under communism, or actually no, this was before communism. Was it? Yeah, this was 1920s. So
Yeah.
I think those were Jews who were expelled for whatever reason, and they sent them to Harbin, China. And so Harbin used the Jews to build up that city. And the Jews ended up building the infrastructure for something like 90% of the city that exists now. Unfortunately, it was short-lived. I think that they were expelled after only a couple of decades, but those couple of decades were very fruitful for China because the Jews
Sure.
they started the theater, they started major stores, built up apartment buildings, like really turned it into this vital economic force. So just, that's the thing with being a Jew, right? Like every day I learn more about Jewish diaspora communities that I never knew existed. To me, it's fascinating. So I'd like to turn to you. So you had mentioned China. Who in your family was born there or lived there, and how did it happen?
Yeah, actually, it's my husband's mother who was born in China, and her parents left Russia.
Mhm.
And similar to your family, they were just, some pogroms and this idea to leave, but also this idea of creating a better life and then following your neighbors for one thing.
Mhm.
But prior to that, like the Jews leaving Spain to Argentina in the first wave, 16th century, there was a lot of economic drive. And there's this idea of building your own nation, your own community elsewhere, and bringing your ideas with you. So in terms of my in-laws, not my in-laws, my in-laws, my husband's grandparents went from Russia to Shanghai. And this was in the 1920s. And because there was already a thriving community and word gets out, then people go there seeking a better life. And it sounds simple, but it really is the complexity of, like you said, building a nation, and China having an open door policy because they want the Jews to bring in this cosmopolitan aspect of building and of creating schools and creating theater. And in fact, a lot of Jewish literature was translated into Chinese. And they read Hannah Arendt, just to name a modern philosopher, but they read many others as well. And I think recently there was a Fiddler on the Roof rendition.
Yes.
Yeah.
I heard that one from Japan, and everyone
Yeah.
was fascinated. And then you're right. And then I read a couple of days ago that China also had a very popular one, A Fiddler on the Roof,
Yeah.
and that both China and Japan said that even though obviously originally it was a Jewish story, but they felt like their people could relate to
Yeah.
that, their culture. I'm not sure how,
Yeah.
but I think that's great. I
I
don't
think the
think
struggle, I think, is something people feel. And like you said, the Jews have a way of connecting with themselves, obviously personally, but also connecting with others in a way that allows others to adopt their ideas.
Mhm.
So I think that's an example of that particular aspect of the fact that our culture is rich, it's encompassing in terms of that it fits a whole realm and a whole society. As far as other Jews moving from Russia to China and actually Germany as well, it was actually created by the Germans themselves. I mean, they're the ones that initiated and instigated the movement after 1938 of Jews from Germany after Kristallnacht to China. So they perpetrated this whole thing because they were in alliance with Japan. Japan was in control of Shanghai. So it's really mired in kind of this swampy mixture of Japan and China and Germany and Russia. And again, so many variables and so many stories and so many like outlets and tributaries to this. But Joshua, my husband's mom, was born in China. Her passport also said that. His father was actually American, stationed in China, where they met, and then they married and then moved to the United States after a tour of the world with his work. So ironically, my husband was born in Japan in an army base, although his passport said Japan. And I was born in Argentina, and that's what my passport says. But going back to what we've been talking about, really there is a lack of understanding, but also how can we know everything? Right. So every time my husband and I travel, they look at my passport, his passport, they look at us, and he's Ashkenazi Jew. And then we always go into the back room and we get interrogated for hours because they don't quite understand how you can be from Japan and look like you do, and how you can be from Argentina and look like you do.
You're like, how many drugs? How many drugs are you smuggling?
Yeah, and I'm not saying this to discredit the TSA or anyone, but even bringing up the fact that look at how much research you've done and how much knowledge you have, and all the work that you deliberately put into becoming knowledgeable and becoming aware and understanding the vast history, and how much you still have to know. So there is no Jewish history. There's no Jewish education in the United States as rich as it should be. And that's why taking back the narrative is so powerful. You're offering something that really hasn't been done and needs to be done, because again, we're more than holidays, right? We're more than Moses and the Holocaust. And you've already proven that with your podcast. You've also demonstrated that with your research, your knowledge, your lectures, your teaching, your curriculum. And no one's going to be able to do that work because it's extensive. And as you said, we need to integrate that into our curriculum, into our temples, wherever, into our media, so that we get the full story and we get the fact that Jews are indigenous to Israel, that Jews have had a presence all over the world. That doesn't mean that they are not Jewish, and that Jewish is not a race, which it is.
No, and I thank you so much for being part of the team, a very integral part of the team. Director of Educational Outreach means so much. I've been doing this by myself for about a year, and I knew that I needed a very competent partner in all this. And so, like when we were emailing back and forth, I knew you had so much to contribute. I knew that you saw the vision of taking back the narrative. You get it, you understand. It's not slogan Zionism. It's so easy to say, I love Israel. We are Jews, we're united, and that's fine. But there's also the educational component. And I think in a way, I was just on the Jewish Broadcasting channel, and it was hard to, I didn't even realize I said it. And when I said it, it was hard to swallow, but then I said it again because I needed to hear myself say it. And one of the questions was, so how did you get into Zionism education? And I said, because I was anti-Semitic for 20 years. Just hearing those words was shocking, but it's true. And so coming from that other side and realizing what it took to change my opinion, and I'm Jewish, I did not grow up with any anti-Israel propaganda from homes, from a religious institution. I can just see, in a way, it's like we can blame a lot of non-Jews, for being anti-Semitic and how could they, but those who really grew up mired in that heat, what other choice did they have, right? Unless they know the truth from doing their own research, right? Which is why we have to admire, in my opinion, a lot of Muslim Zionists, right? Who did grow up with that hate. And despite all of that, upon learning the facts, wanted to then share it with others. And many of them ended up in jail, being tortured, being ostracized, being kicked out of their countries. And we have the luxury of, so far, not being that prosecuted. Of course, our accounts can get a shadow banned and blocked. Okay, we can take that. We're not being tortured. But yes, so we took that importance of filling in the historical gap, right? So what happened to Jews in Israel between the exiles and the liberation of Jews, the liberation of Israel in 1948? And then you realize, it's time to start using correct terminology, right? Israel was created in 48. All Jews did not leave, after the destruction of the Second Temple. First of all, doesn't it make sense from a common sense point of view, right? So what, Rome didn't tax anyone in the region, they left there. And then, understanding that and I was guilty of this too, growing up, people would say what's your background? And I would say, oh, I'm Russian. And then I learned but I also have German, right? My family spent time in Germany, in Austria. I knew that I had along the way, like some family in Italy. So why am I saying Russian when I'm not Russian? Like I have not a drop of Russian blood in me, in my
Yeah.
veins. And so it's switching, the semantics, right? Saying like I'm a Jew, uh, the ancestral heartland of Israel is Judea and Samaria, not using the anti-Semitic 1950 Jordanian term West Bank, knowing that Jews are not settlers on their own land, knowing that we cannot annex our own land. That's our land. It's being stolen by the Palestinian Authority, which is nothing more than a terrorist organization. And at the same time, like understanding that there are other groups in Israel who had lived in Israel for thousands of years. We were just the only ones that happened to be indigenous to Israel. But like we also can't forget the Druze who lived there, almost as long as we have. They're just not from there. Arameans have had a long history in parts of Israel as well. Again, just not indigenous from there. So just being cognizant and being balanced, I think really does help in combating anti-Semitism. So again, I could not have a more confident educational outreach. And I see the path to combat anti-Semitism. So when anyone asks me, oh my gosh, like I'm so scared, anti-Semitism is rising, I said, first of all, don't be scared. Let's be strong. Our people have survived a hell of a lot worse throughout the ages. And second of all, let's not complain anymore. Like whoever's listening and really wants to, we'll never going to conquer anti-Semitism. It's an evil that's been around since 800 AD. And no, the Romans were not anti-Semitic. It just cost them more men and money to conquer than anyone else. But actual anti-Semitism did begin in 800 AD, it began in Europe. So this is something that Jews have been going through for, close to 2,000 years. Unfortunately, 500,000, 2,000 years, Jews still will be dealing with anti-Semitism. But if we want to make any dent in it, it is possible to do. That takes action.
Yeah, and I love what you said, common sense and strength. Right. Let's play to our strengths. I was just recently in Israel, and I went to Eilat, the Red Sea, and I was talking to the director of the Marine Institute to find out how to make the Red Sea a UNESCO site, a heritage site to preserve it. And he was informing me that there was some pushback from the Arab neighboring nations. And with the cameras that are underwater, you could see a thriving coral reef in Israel and a not so thriving coral reef on the side of Jordan and Egypt and Syria. And interestingly enough, he was telling me that they were stating that Mossad had released sharks. And the sharks had eaten up their coral reef on their side. And my immediate response was, oh, that was me. And he looked at me and he laughed because humor is one of our strengths. Nice. And when people are creating stories and they're not using common sense, you can find a way to ask them to really think about what they're saying and what they think. And you can do it in a way that's clever. So if someone does, attack you with some concocted narrative, you can either own up to it, because then they'll take a step back and go, wait, I was lying. So how can you own up to something that I was making up, but did I make it up? And so they're in a quandary. And that's one of our strengths, humor. And that goes back centuries as well, not just Seinfeld. There's lots of stories, right, where you use Jewish humor. Even Alberto Gershonov used a great deal of humor to talk about the ways in which the Jews adjusted to living in Argentina, right? But still thrived, still prospered. So yeah, definitely finding ways, like you said, to stand tall, to take a stand, and like you said, do not cower or be fearful when people are flinging propaganda at you, because propaganda and slogans are, kitschy, but they don't have any weight and they don't have any bearing. And once you pose yourself in terms of a question or in terms of admission, you'll see their reaction. And I've also experienced it myself where someone at the university put a flyer in my face. It happened to be their quote unquote Nakba demonstration where they're saying that the creation of Israel was a catastrophe. And I responded by stating, I don't want their propaganda. And do they really think that their idea of peace can be based on their terrorism? And because they couldn't answer that question, their response was, I'm a woman of color and you're a racist. So my response was, well, I'm a woman of color and you're racist. And so then there was a dead still because what can someone say to that? And so you really have to know your history. You have to know where you come from, and you're providing that. Your research, your extensive knowledge, your ability to disseminate complex, narratives in digestible and palatable form is outstanding. And yeah, and I'm proud to work with you. I took my cards to Israel. I passed them to everyone I know. And I think we need to have this discussion also in Israel with people who are just thinking now that if you have a quote unquote Palestinian state, at least it will prevent a Palestinian majority in Israel. And some people believe that. And so these are issues we need to attend to and address and understand. We don't live there. These are the things they're concerned about. And how do we learn more about it so that we can be proactive?
And meanwhile, my most favorite Muslim Zionist, Mohammed Kabia, clearly stated that he is no Palestinian. He's a proud Bedouin. And so I wish that a lot of these anti-Israel organizations and politicians and whatever else is going on there would actually talk to Arabs in Israel, because a great majority do not consider themselves falsely Palestinian. They will say, we're Bedouin, we are Druze, we're Aramean, we're Arab Christian. And if you go into Judea and Samaria, the Israeli government knows which of the so-called Arab clans actually are genetically Jewish. And it was done voluntarily. Like it wasn't Israel who came in and started, jabbing swabs of their cheeks. It literally was a volunteer effort. And so it's so complex, right? And there's no black and white in most history, not just in Israel. But at the same time, like you said, it starts with Jews. I don't blame Muslims. I mean, I only blame terrorists for obviously, being terrorists, but I don't, how could I blame Muslims when Muslims will say, well, look at If Not Now, look at J Street, look at now AIPAC even, right? Like they're advocating for a terrorist two-state solution without acknowledging that Jordan is the second state of the region of Palestine. There was never a country of Palestine. So until we get our shit together, for lack of better words, and it's the most direct way to say it, we can't blame anyone else. But I think it's also important to use our Muslim partners. Many of there are many. Think about it, there are 1.6 billion Muslims, probably more at this point in the world, and yes, 25%, I think was quoted as being, on the extremes, and that's a lot of people. But you have many, many who are pro-Israel. You just have, Saudi Arabia, who wants, you were talking about the Red Sea, they actually want a Red Sea economy. And there's a difference too, I think too many Jewish publications, they freak out, like, oh my gosh, the Saudis are not gonna, make peace with Israel until XYZ. But then they don't understand that in the Arab world, words and actions do not align, right? Like you remember Arafat, peace, 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 and then bomb, 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 right? Like suicide bombings and everything like that. But then you have the MBS of Saudi Arabia, who actions are very pro-Israel. It's the biggest secret right now that Saudi Arabia has excellent relations with Israel. But the words he has to politically appeal or appease is a better term for this, the mullahs. even his
Right.
father being one of them, right? His father was the biggest anti-Semite in the kingdom. And so it is a fine line for him, despite the exhilarating reforms that he has implemented. And the time will come, I honestly see a real peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel within the next 2 years. He has other issues on the plate. Not every country is focused on having a formal agreement with Israel. Saudi Arabia has its own economy to deal with, has Iran, and its very nascent, peace agreement that it had to take care of in order to end the war in Yemen somehow. So I think the Jewish world needs to take a deep breath, step back, appreciate the progress at dizzying speeds that has been happening within the Arab world and Israel, and no small thanks to the work of Netanyahu, who really put
Yeah.
in over a decade. As much as like I'm a Trump supporter, but Trump did very little to secure the Abraham Accords. It was actually without Netanyahu's work, the Accords would never have happened. No matter how many times Kushner would have flown, into, into Dubai. So I think
Yeah.
these are actually a lot more positive than they are.
Yeah.
And I know someone like myself who does consume a lot of social media, and there are a lot of organizations who scream about anti-Semitism and everyone hates Jews. It's just not the truth. I mean, yes, there is anti-Semitism, but this is not
Right.
1938. Kristallnacht is not happening because we have a very strong Israel. Israel's not going anywhere. And we need to celebrate that and support that.
Absolutely. And like you said, it's like a Wizard of Oz moment where people don't know what's happening behind the curtain. And unfortunately, there is a lot going on that people are not aware of, and they might be just prone to fall in line with whatever is happening on social media or whatever they see in terms of a parade that then they just join without, thinking about the issue at all. And that seems to be, I think, an American thing, which I've noticed. And even recently, I went to another conference, and the speaker blatantly maligned Israel and stated that it's the longest military occupation, and everyone in the audience stood up and clapped. But I think it's because they don't know better. They don't know anything. And you tell them something, on social media, and they believe it. So it really is food for thought in terms of the kinds of strategies we need to take. Israel's busy creating a conglomerate of fantastic technology, et cetera, cutting edge, pharmaceuticals, you name it, they're there. And while they're concentrating on providing, goods and services to the world, unfortunately, they're not spending perhaps all their efforts and time into social media propaganda that, will counter the propaganda against it. So there's no discussion there. They just kind of ignore it and let it kind of slide, thinking that the American public will be more intelligent and ask questions. And unfortunately, as far as I can tell, there is a failure of the American public to do just that.
Absolutely. And again, when we say American public, it's mostly Jews, right? Like, so if Jews want to, quote unquote, combat anti-Semitism, okay, voting a certain way, but also, the organizations that they donate to, that they support, push them to be more pro-Israel and using their correct terminology and not supporting two-state solutions and not hosting a very self-hating anti-Semitic ambassador, AJC, who just did that. So again, small actions do produce major results. I like to work inward to expand outward. And so again, I'm so happy to have you on board. And thank you for sharing your family history. I originally, one of the reasons that we're doing this season, which I was calling and still am calling the the diversity within the Jewish diaspora communities. And I really wanted to focus a lot more on the Mizrahi experience, just because in America, the vast majority here are Ashkenaz Jews. And so a lot of Ashkenaz Jews don't know about Bukharian Jews or Libyan Jews or Yemeni Jews and their thousands of years of
Yeah.
amazing history. But when you and I were talking offline and emailing, I really wanted to, even though we're both, majority Ashkenaz, I said, how many like even know that, they're Argentinian Jews, who are Ashkenaz, right? Or that
Yeah.
some Ashkenaz ended up in China. So I think that also is important, that even within Ashkenaz, there is a lot of movement diversity, community diversity. So I thank you for encouraging me to share these stories with the audience.
Yeah, absolutely, because these stories have been sort of relegated to academia.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I've attended many lectures and read many books. And so you're correct. There's knowledge there, but it seems to be confined and it becomes claustrophobic because it's hard to share. So again, commending you for taking all that material and creating a sort of public humanities project where you're able to translate and transfer these ideas, right, and these histories and these foundations to everyone else.
Well, thank you so much. You've been an amazing guest, very eloquent, and really dug into the issues that I had only surface level knowledge of. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to working with you for hopefully years to come. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lori.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.